The marble floors of the servant quarters in the Al-Thani palace gleamed faintly beneath the early morning light, catching and scattering the first golden threads of dawn like quiet jewels across their polished surface. Above, the high arched ceilings trapped the last breaths of night, and the air still held the chill of the desert's long silence. The palace had not yet stirred, and in this pocket of stillness, Hana moved like memory, soft, careful, reverent. She was packing. Each fold of fabric, each carefully placed garment, was a goodbye. There was no chaos in her movement, only precision, ritual almost. The garments she laid one over the other were modest, linen caftans, a scarf embroidered at the edge with gold thread, a faded abaya worn thin at the elbows. Each thread had served her quietly, as she had served this palace. Her fingers lingered longer than needed, tracing the textures as though they could carry pieces of her heart with them. At the bottom of the bag, she placed a velvet pouch. Its contents were small, a single earring from her mother, a date stone carved with the word saber, and the letter, folded so many times its edges had softened, its contents sharper than any blade. She had read it once. Once was enough. Tariq's voice had lived in those inked lines, measured, final, detached. A shift in alliances, a better match, a dowry worth more than memories. He had gone with the daughter of a spice merchant, the kind of woman whose name arrived with silks and sugar. Hana had not been given a warning, only the letter. He had signed it with formality, not with love, not even with regret. She had pressed the paper to her chest once, as if to stop her heart from splitting. Now it was only weight. Ya Allah. Her voice cracked the silence, not in volume, but in its tenderness. It was not the kind of prayer made to be heard. It was not the kind of prayer that expected reply, but someone was listening. Just beyond the mashrabia screen, a carved veil of stone that filtered sunlight and gaze, Prince Zayed Al-Thani stood beneath the colonnade that bordered the inner garden. He had come before sunrise, as he often did, drawn not by duty, but by unrest. The palace slept, but his thoughts never did. He had always found comfort in the pre-dawn hush, when the palace whispered only to those who knew how to listen. Today, it whispered her. He heard the prayer, low, intimate, a voice wrapped in silk and salt. He saw her only in silhouette through the latticework, but the sound rooted him to the stone. A woman, one of the servant class, though he could not place her name. She moved with the grace of someone used to absence, the composure of someone who had learned not to ask. But her voice, it trembled like a string pulled too tight. He should have walked away. Instead, he watched the way her hands moved, the ritual of goodbye in motion. And when she pressed her satchel shut, when her shoulders curled inward, when her head bowed in supplication to no one watching, something moved within him, something slow and old, like sand shifting beneath ancient stone. Inside her chamber, Hana sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the satchel now closed beside her. The room was stripped of personal trace. No framed photo, no perfume bottle, only a small brass lantern swaying gently with the breeze, casting fractured light upon the walls. She glanced once more at the space around her, but her memory had already begun the process of unspooling. Departure had its own rhythm, and hers had already begun. The rustle of soft footsteps made her turn. Noor. The little girl stood barefoot in the doorway, her dress crumpled from sleep, her braids undone. In her hands she clutched a necklace made of date seeds, threaded with patient, childlike care. Noor asked. Hana's voice caught. She knelt slowly, bringing her gaze level with the child's. Yes, Habibti. Noor's eyes were solemn. I asked the moon to follow you. Hana smiled, the kind of smile made entirely of ache. The child reached forward and tucked the necklace into Hana's palm. Hana did not speak. She could not. She rose, her shawl wrapped around her like armor, and stepped into the corridor. The quiet of the palace enveloped her, each column and mosaic now a witness to her exit. As she passed the inner garden, a breeze stirred the jasmine climbing the palace walls, their scent folded into the oud still lingering in the morning air, sweet, smoky, full of longing. From the edge of the colonnade, Zayed watched her retreating form. He said nothing, did nothing, but he would not forget, not the prayer, not the sorrow, not the silence she carried like a veil. Hana did not know her path had already changed, that fate, always listening, had found her voice at last. The morning unfolded with solemn elegance, as if the palace itself understood that something sacred had been set in motion. Hana moved through the inner corridors like a thread unraveling from the hem of a tapestry, subtle, unnoticed by most, yet essential to the fabric that held the space together. Her steps, though light, pressed into the stone with quiet determination, each one bearing the full weight of departure not just from a place, but from the illusion of belonging. The satchel in her hand felt heavier now, not with objects, but with absences, with the echo of a love that had chosen profit over poetry, and with the silence of a woman who had learned to carry pain in graceful folds. She passed beneath vaulted ceilings where colored glass filtered the morning light into soft mosaics on the floor, and as she moved through familiar hallways, the rose garden where she once sang softly to herself, the west colonnade where she used to watch the doves settle before dusk, each place looked back at her. She paused by the eastern fountain, a small marble basin shaped like a blooming star, its water cool and constant. There, she crouched and dipped her fingers into the basin's mirrored surface, watching the ripples distort her reflection into something fragmented and unrecognizable. She no longer saw the woman who once whispered hope into closed windows, who waited for letters with ink still warm. What remained was someone refined by fire, elegant in loss, sharpened by surrender. It was then she felt it, not the sound of another's approach, but the subtle shift in the air that signaled presence. She did not need to turn to know who stood behind her, and still, when he spoke, his voice poured into the moment, like frankincense melting over charcoal. Low, deliberate, intimate in its restraint. "You prayed this morning," said Prince Zayed, his words not inquisitive but affirming. Hana's hand stilled in the water. Her eyes remained on the moving reflection. She rose slowly, the folds of her abaya falling around her like a curtain settling after a performance never applauded. When she turned, her gaze met his, not with fear or awe, but with the evenness of someone who had already lost the most precious thing she could offer. "That prayer was not given to be heard," she said, her voice steady but soft, like parchment brushed by wind. "I know," he replied, and the stillness between them deepened. There was no accusation in her expression, no retreat, only a quiet awareness that she had been witnessed in her most fragile moment by a man who stood leagues above her in power, yet now, strangely, seemed leveled by the vulnerability they shared. She asked, her tone neither cold nor open, merely factual, like the edge of a blade that does not threaten but remains sharp nonetheless. He did not answer immediately, and when he did, it was with the honesty of someone who had not prepared his own truth. "I don't know, only to carry it, your prayer." She considered him for a moment, studying the lines of his face, his stillness, his careful posture, the faint tension near his eyes that betrayed the cost of control. And then, with the gentleness of someone placing a fragile truth back into a stranger's hands, she offered a single sentence, "Then carry it carefully." Neither of them moved. The jasmine curled around the colonnade trembled in the breeze, and somewhere beyond, a falcon cried into the pale sky. She turned from him then, and this time, he did not stop her. Yet the silence she left behind seemed to shift something within the palace walls, as if the corridors themselves were now tracing her footsteps, recording her in the ledger of those who mattered. As she reached the servants' gate, the heavy brass door carved with geometric patterns stood partly open. One of the guards, Yusuf, stood nearby with his eyes lowered, a gesture of quiet respect that transcended class. No words passed between them, and perhaps that was more fitting. Farewells, Hana had learned, often said too much or far too little. She stepped forward, her satchel brushing against her hip, the final breath of palace air curling around her like a memory refusing to fade. Then came the interruption. Not harsh, not unwelcome, but sudden. The sound of bare feet striking marble in staccato rhythm. A small storm of urgency contained in a child's frame. Noor appeared in the archway, arms outstretched, a linen-wrapped bundle cradled in her hands. "You forgot this," she said. The words pushed through breathlessness. Hana bent as Noor reached her, opening the cloth to reveal the carved ivory comb, her mother's. She had not known it was missing. "It was under your bed," Noor continued, eyes wide and certain. The logic was pure, beautiful, and in that moment, more powerful than any blessing Hana had ever received. Noor's voice lowered, a promise disguised as a child's farewell, and then she stepped through the gate, into the city beyond. The light of morning spilled around her, gold pressed into stone, and behind her, the scent of oud and jasmine remained suspended in the air. She did not look back, but she felt the weight of eyes, not only the prince's but the palace itself, watching, remembering, and perhaps already missing something it had never dared claim. Long after the silhouette of Hana disappeared beyond the palace gates, the space she had occupied refused to empty. The morning light shifted across the marble with the grace of silk unraveling, but Prince Zayed did not move. He remained beneath the carved colonnade, still as the pillars that framed him, his gaze fixed not on the path she had taken, but on the silence she had left behind. It was not the kind of silence born of absence. It was something heavier, denser, like the hush in a sacred chamber after a prayer has been spoken. The very air seemed to echo with the weight of her presence, as if the palace itself recognized that something rare had just slipped from its hands. He was not unfamiliar with departures. Nobles fell from favor. Ambassadors came and went. Servants rotated through the palace like seasons. Faces changed, roles filled, names forgotten. But this felt different. The woman who had walked away had not shouted, had not begged, had not left behind scandal or blame. She had simply folded herself into motion and vanished, leaving only a trail of quiet that now curled around his thoughts like incense winding through a chamber. It clung not to his ears, but to his memory. He turned finally, but not toward duty. His feet, unbidden, led him back through the garden where she had paused. Each step slowed, not because of hesitation, but reverence, as though the place had become a kind of shrine. He arrived at the stone bench near the fountain shaped like 6 petals and sat without ceremony. The marble was still cool beneath him, holding the temperature of dawn like a memory it refused to let go. He leaned forward, brushing his fingers over the surface of the water, imitating her earlier gesture. The ripples distorted his reflection, and for a moment, he was grateful. He did not wish to see his face, only to remember hers. There had been something unteachable in the way she held her sorrow. It was not stoicism. It was not resignation. It was discipline, woven with grace, the kind of strength that came not from assertion, but from restraint. He had witnessed rage. He had known ambition. But this prayerful surrender was unfamiliar. It unsettled him, not in fear, but in awareness. As though some layer of the world he had never thought to question had shifted, revealing something truer beneath it. He stayed there a long while, letting the rhythm of the fountain lull his thoughts into shapes he didn't yet know how to name. And when he rose, he moved not with the decisiveness of a prince, but with the unspoken pull of curiosity mixed with gravity. He crossed the courtyard and made his way to a part of the palace he had rarely entered, the administrative wing where records were kept, where servants' names were documented, assigned, replaced. The archive room was dim and cool, its air tinged with parchment, dust and ink. Scrolls lined the walls in endless rows, and behind a low desk sat the record keeper, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual scent of dates. He looked up in confusion at the prince's entrance, but asked no questions, only bowed in silent deference. Zayed scanned the rows until he found what he needed. Hana bint Maisara. Her file was unremarkable. Arrived 2 years ago from a coastal village near Al-Waqra, hired through the recommendation of an elder widow, noted only for punctuality and discretion. No commendations, no violations. A name so thinly etched into palace life that it barely existed, until today. He ran his thumb over the ink. He wanted to know more, but the records offered no stories, only numbers, only facts. It angered him, softly, like a wind that keeps knocking against a closed window. How many other names had passed through these halls, carrying unseen dignity, unrecorded grace? And why had it taken this departure for him to notice? Later, as the sun dipped toward the sea and the golden hour brushed the palace walls in shades of honey and flame, Zayed stood alone in his chambers. The window overlooked the city, its white stone towers rising toward the sky like silent prayers. Beyond them, the dunes shimmered in the heat, and the ocean pulled its tide toward distant lands. He remained motionless, eyes tracing nothing in particular, thoughts spiraling around the echo of her voice. Ya Allah, grant me dignity in my leaving. Such a simple prayer, and yet it refused to loosen its grip on him. He had not heard desperation in it, but purity, as though she had offered her pain to something larger than herself, not for resolution, but for the strength to carry it without shame. He envied that, not her sorrow, but the clarity of it, the way she had placed it on the world like a polished stone and walked away. He wondered what kind of life taught a woman to pray like that, and he feared, perhaps for the first time, that the world he knew, the one sculpted by titles, duty, and performance, had made him deaf to voices that had whispered all along beneath the noise. He had heard her, but far more haunting was the realization that she, perhaps, had heard something even deeper, and that she had never needed anyone to save her, only to witness, and somehow, that changed everything. Beyond the brass gate, the city stretched in soft golden layers, the light of morning falling like honey over domes, towers, and alleyways, still veiled in the breath of dawn. For a moment, Hana stood at the threshold, her eyes adjusting not to the sun, but to the absence of protocol. There were no guards now to bow or judge, no whispered titles to precede her name. Here, she was no one, a woman in an abaya, a silhouette amid the shifting sea of motion. And in that anonymity, something within her began to loosen, slowly, painfully, like cloth tearing at its seam after holding for too long. She walked. The city of Doha, vibrant and ancient, unfolded around her like a tapestry in motion. Each street corner hummed with history, archways hand-carved by craftsmen now gone, lanterns swaying on rusted iron, cats slipping between the legs of market tables laden with pistachios, dates, and saffron. The world smelled of cardamom and bread, sea salt and sun-warmed limestone, but to Hana, it all came like echoes through thick glass. She could see it, name it, even appreciate its beauty, but she was not yet in it, not fully. Her soul still walked several steps behind her body, lagging somewhere between the sound of Noor's voice and the feel of Zayed's gaze upon her back. She made her way toward the outer edge of Souk Waqif, past the weavers' stalls and the perfume alleys, into a quieter part of the quarter where Dahlia lived, a spice seller known as much for her remedies as her tongue. The old woman had once told Hana that healing came not from silence, but from being heard in places where no one expected to find truth. "Come to me," she had said, years ago, pressing dried rose petals into Hana's palm. Hana had never forgotten. Dahlia's home was modest, a room above a shop, with faded paint and vines curling up the stone like forgotten verses of poetry. The door opened before Hana could knock, and there the woman stood, wrapped in indigo cotton, her silver hair bound in a loose braid, her eyes sharp as ever. She looked Hana over once, not with surprise, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a moment long foretold. "You've arrived," she said, stepping aside. Hana crossed the threshold. Inside, the room smelled of cumin, wood smoke, and old ink. Shelves lined the walls, jars of spice, scrolls of herbal chants, pomegranates split open like offerings, lanterns lit with pale gold light. There was no preamble. Dahlia did not demand explanations. She gestured to a cushion beneath the window and handed Hana a cup of tea brewed dark, its surface scattered with floating clove buds. "You're safe here," she said. Hana took the cup in both hands, holding it not for warmth, but for grounding. She sat in silence, allowing her body to settle into the earth-colored rug beneath her, allowing her breath to finally slow. Outside the small window, the street carried on, men debating loudly over crates of textiles, a child leading a goat on a red rope, a muezzin's call threading through the heat like a sacred ribbon. She watched it all from the edge of herself, feeling like a ghost whose heart had not yet decided to return. Later, alone in the room, she opened her satchel and found the ivory comb wrapped carefully inside linen. It was her mother's, forgotten in the rush, returned by a child who spoke in moonlight and faith. She ran the comb slowly through her hair, each stroke a quiet act of reclaiming, each pull separating her from the version of herself who had once believed that love alone was enough to anchor a future. Her reflection in the brass mirror on the wall looked older than she remembered, not in years, but in having endured something that could not be named aloud. Meanwhile, within the alabaster walls of the palace, Prince Zayed walked through the long hallway of his private wing, ignoring the rhythmic footsteps of his attendants behind him. The court had resumed its usual choreography, visiting dignitaries, trade negotiations, whispered ambitions, But for him, it all played in muffled tones. The world around him was intact, yet a small fissure had opened somewhere below the surface, and now every word, every exchange, passed through that crack. He stood at the top of the western terrace, where the wind came stronger from the sea, and stared out over the rooftops of the city. He imagined her down there, somewhere among the winding lanes and tiled courtyards, beneath a different roof, holding a different kind of quiet. He wondered if she still thought of the prayer, if she regretted speaking it aloud, even unknowingly. He wondered why he still felt its echo. In the distance, the call to prayer wove its way across the skyline. The sound bent over domes and water, touching even the quietest corners of the palace. And Zayed, though surrounded by silk and marble, felt further from peace than he had in years, not because something had been taken from him, but because something had been revealed, and now he could no longer pretend he hadn't seen it. That night, he dreamed not of power or war councils, not of his father or his future. He dreamed of a small courtyard where a woman knelt beside a fountain, her fingers trailing water that turned to light. She did not speak, she did not rise. But when she looked at him, her eyes carried the entire sky, and he woke with her name on his lips, though he did not say it aloud. Elsewhere, in Dahlia's small room, Hana lay still beneath a woven blanket, the air warm and thick with silence. Outside her window, the moon rode high, round, pale, and watchful. Noor had told it to follow her. And though she did not believe in such things, she looked toward it anyway, and whispered back. And the moon, for what it was worth, did not turn away. The days unfolded in slow, deliberate breaths, as if time itself had shifted its rhythm to match the quiet rupture between two worlds. In the quarter behind Souk Waqif, where walls were faded with history and windows opened to the scent of cumin, sea wind, and stories never written, Hana began to craft a new existence, not through grand declarations or reinventions, but in the smallest acts of survival. She swept the stone steps of Dahlia's entrance with the patience of someone learning to touch the world again. She ground spices by hand, inhaling their ancient warmth, turmeric, sumac, cinnamon, and let them cling to her fingers as if scent alone could stitch her into the present. Her silences grew softer, more contemplative, no longer bound by grief, but stretched across the hours like linen drying in the wind. She still said little, but her gaze began to return to the world, following the curve of smoke from the nearby bakery, the laughter of children washing figs at the fountain, the elderly men playing tawla beneath a tattered canopy. This city, for all its noise, had become a shelter, not because it was quiet, but because it asked nothing of her except to remain, to breathe, to endure. Inside Dahlia's home, life carried a rhythm of its own. Birds nested in the crooked beams of the ceiling. Tea boiled over coals, while incense unfurled its blue spirals toward the rafters. And Hana, in moments when her hands were still, would sit by the open window, with her mother's ivory comb in her lap, letting the evening breeze brush her cheek, as if in benediction. She no longer cried. Her tears had dried somewhere between departure and awakening, but sorrow still curled beneath her ribs like a sleeping cat, present, warm, and unwilling to leave just yet. Sometimes she thought of him, not in the fevered ache of betrayal, but in the quiet echo of the garden, the moment he stood behind her, not touching, not speaking, but listening. That kind of presence had stayed with her, woven into memory more vividly than all the months of unseen glances or respectful distance. He had said little, but his silence had not felt empty. It had felt deliberate. She told herself she didn't miss the palace, and it was true. She didn't miss its routines, its hierarchy, the endless dance of propriety. But she missed the person she had been when she believed her place there was chosen, not permitted. She missed the girl who could trust her days without fearing their end. And deep within the palace walls, Zayed found that his world, so orderly, so rehearsed, had begun to fray at the edges. He attended council meetings, yes. He issued decisions, read reports, answered to his father with the polished ease of royal discipline. But his mind wandered in the spaces between words, caught in fragments of a voice that had prayed not for love, but for dignity. That prayer had become a thread in his chest, pulling him inward, backward, toward a truth he had never been trained to confront, the value of a soul who asked nothing and, in asking nothing, revealed everything. He sought silence more often now, not to retreat, but to hear what the palace drowned out. He returned to the garden where he had first heard her. He walked the same path she had walked, each stone etched with memory. The palace cats watched him with mild curiosity. The fountain still whispered. The jasmine vines had grown longer, climbing toward the sun, blooming in quiet defiance of containment. On one such walk, he noticed something strange. A ribbon, pale green and faded, knotted around one of the vines. It was small, easily overlooked, but he knew the fabric. It had once tied the satchel she carried. Had she left it behind on purpose? Had the wind taken it from her as a final offering? He untied it slowly and slipped it into his pocket. It felt like touching something sacred, not because it was hers, but because it had survived. At night, in his chambers, he found himself reaching for old poetry again, not for wisdom, but for resonance. He read the Sufis, the mystics, the poets who spoke of love as hunger, as fire, as mercy wrapped in ache. He found himself staring at lines like wounds on the page, asking questions he had never allowed to surface. What was loyalty if it required blindness? What was power if it silenced compassion? And what kind of man was he, if he could recognize beauty only once it had turned its back on him? The name of the spice vendor came to him like a bell, Dalia bint Rafi. He remembered her vaguely, a woman of fierce eyes and sharper words, once reprimanded for selling clove cures that cured nothing. But now, in that name, he saw direction. He said nothing to his advisors. He gave no orders to his guards. But in the deep quiet of midnight, he sent a single message through one of the stable boys. A delivery of jasmine, wrapped in indigo silk, with no note, no seal, just scent and color. He did not know if it would reach her. He only knew that if she recognized it, she would understand. And if she didn't, it would still bloom. It came not with trumpets or proclamations, but with the hush of morning when the world still teetered between dream and awakening. The light was soft, barely touching the rooftops, and the souk had yet to stretch into its usual song of haggling voices and bustling carts. Hana stood outside Dalia's small door, bent over a basin of water, rinsing stalks of mint, the coolness of it slipping between her fingers like threads of memory she refused to gather. Her thoughts were quiet, not peaceful, but steady. There was comfort, she'd learned, in simple repetition, in the scent of herbs, in the weight of water, in work that asked for nothing but presence. She did not hear the boy's approach until his shadow crossed her hands. He was young, barefoot, no more than 11. His eyes flicked upward only once, then dropped to the cloth bundle in his hands, a square of indigo silk, folded with surprising care, fragrant even before it was opened. "For you," he mumbled, voice like sand rubbed against stone. Hana hesitated. The bundle did not belong to this world she had chosen. It glowed softly, as if carrying light from elsewhere. She took it with both hands, her breath caught in her throat before she even understood why. The boy lingered only a second longer, as if debating whether to watch her unwrap it, then turned and disappeared down the alley, swallowed by the dust and morning hush. She stood motionless. The silk was smooth beneath her fingertips, too fine for her world now. A fabric that had no place here among baskets and cracked tiles and tea boiled in dented pots. She brought it close to her chest, and only then did she notice the scent. Jasmine, fresh and unfiltered, as though the blossoms had been gathered moments before dawn. She did not open it right away. Something within her resisted the unraveling, not of the silk, but of what its presence implied. But when she finally did, alone in the quiet shade of Dalia's kitchen, her fingers trembled. Inside were jasmine blooms, nestled without extravagance, their stems wrapped simply in palm twine. No name, no note, only intention. And Hana knew with the same certainty that had risen in her chest when she heard him exhale behind the mashrabia screen that morning in the garden. The same certainty that had pulsed in her ribs when she stepped through the palace gate for the last time, knowing someone had watched her leave. She lowered the flowers slowly, placing them beside the ivory comb on the low table, and sat beside them, as if waiting for them to speak. Dalia, ever observant, passed by the threshold and paused. Her eyes fell on the silk, then the jasmine, then Hana's stillness. She did not ask. She did not need to. Hana reached for her cup but did not drink. Her gaze remained on the flowers, on what they meant, and on what they did not try to explain. She she was not naive. She had lived long enough to know that gestures could be deceitful, that apologies wrapped in beauty often hid obligations beneath them. But this felt different. There was no command in the silk, no plea in the petals, only presence, a memory made tangible, a question without pressure, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. That night, while the city slept beneath a sheet of silver starlight and the sea wind coiled around the alleys like incense, Hana sat beside the window with the silk folded in her lap. The jasmine rested in a shallow bowl of water, their scent lingering in the corners of the room. She did not weep. She did not smile. She only watched the moon rise higher and wondered why this offering, so small, felt heavier than the betrayal that had broken her. She thought of his eyes, sharp but searching, of the way he had said nothing and yet seen everything. She thought of the ribbon she had left behind, the one she never meant to let go. Or had she? Perhaps some part of her had wanted to be remembered. She whispered nothing into the night, only let her fingers trace the folds of the silk again and again, as if drawing a line back to the part of her that still believed in meaning carried without demand. Across the city, in a palace too vast for rest, Prince Zayed stood at his window watching the sky. He had not slept. The jasmine he had sent now bloomed elsewhere. In silence he could not see, but in his heart something had shifted, not soothed, not resolved, but stilled. He had offered something unpolished, not as a ruler, not as a man of titles, but as someone reaching across the space between regret and memory. And though he heard no reply, he felt her silence answering him anyway. In palaces like Zayed's, silence is not absence, it is arrangement. It is the careful choreography of glances, the press of lips that know too much, the music of whispers drifting through hallways scented with oud and order. And though no one had uttered her name in weeks, the air itself remembered Hana. The marble remembered the brush of her steps. The corridors recalled the hush that had followed her like a veil. Her departure had not created a hole, it had created resonance. A vibration beneath routine that turned each ordinary moment slightly off-key. And Prince Zayed, who had once moved through this world with seamless composure, a future carved into the stone of his posture, now bore signs of fracture so subtle, only those trained in the palace's theater could detect them. His robes still gleamed. His voice held authority, but something behind his gaze no longer bowed to expectation. He listened too carefully. He paused too long before answering. He walked alone when he should have been seen. It was during one such solitary walk, in the late hours of the evening, that his father called him to the majlis, not for a conversation, but for a reminder. The emir sat surrounded by advisors, their eyes sharp behind respectful silence. On the table lay scrolls of foreign policy, trade agreements, and delicately placed atop them the dossier of a royal match. Princess Amal of Muscat. He is intelligent, graceful, beloved by her people, the emir said, tapping the scroll lightly. Her family will strengthen our position in the Gulf. Zayed said nothing. The room grew colder. The vizier shifted. The emir studied his son long, and then dismissed the council. When they were alone, the father became less sovereign, more man. You forget your duty, he said softly. I remember it too well, Zayed replied. There was no punishment, not yet. Only silence, measured and simmering. That night, Zayed returned to the jasmine garden. It had become a kind of chapel to him, not sacred for what it was, but for what it remembered. The air there always carried a trace of her presence, even as days slipped away. He sat by the fountain and closed his eyes, listening to the water speak in tongues older than any court language. He had nothing left to say aloud, and yet, within him, words churned. It was there he found the second ribbon, linen, pale, knotted haphazardly around the base of a vine now heavy with white blossoms. A ribbon like a hesitation, or a message left only for the one who knew where to look. He removed it without ceremony, but his hands shook slightly, as if the moment were more than symbolic. He placed it in his breast pocket and returned to his chambers. That night, he did not sleep. He lit no candles. He simply sat in the darkness, the ribbon resting across his palm like a question waiting to be answered by action. And elsewhere, under a roof far humbler than marble, Hana stirred from a restless dream. She had not spoken his name in days, but it had begun appearing in her thoughts like mist on water, unformed, yet impossible to ignore. The jasmine had dried. The silk remained folded beneath her pillow, but the silence between them had changed color. It no longer protected her. It haunted her. Because in that silence, she had begun to hear herself again. Not the girl who loved, but the woman who had seen the price of being unseen. She stepped outside into the alley, barefoot, the stones cool beneath her feet. The city slept. Only the call of a distant owl pierced the quiet. The words vanished into the dark. But she felt for the first time that someone might have heard. Inside the shop the next morning, Dahlia watched her with unreadable eyes. She said nothing for a long while, until Hana dropped a jar of cumin and didn't bend to pick it up. "You are not running," Dahlia said. Hana blinked. "You do," Dahlia said, not unkindly. And later that night, when Hana lay beneath her woven blanket, the scent of jasmine long since faded but memory still clinging to the threads, she closed her eyes and saw not his face, but his silence. The silence that had asked nothing, promised nothing, yet reached her deeper than any plea. In another world of glass and gold, Zayed stood by the window of his chamber, the ribbon now resting beside a sealed letter he had not yet dared send. The time for stillness was ending. Something, someone, was calling both of them to choose. Dawn arrived without its usual softness. It did not kiss the rooftops or caress the pavilions. It pierced. A light too sharp for lingering dreams, too honest for secrets, poured over the palace like a verdict. Marble reflected it ruthlessly, and the domes of gold shone not with glory but scrutiny. There was no haze to cushion it, no breeze to temper its weight. It was the kind of morning when the world shifts, not with thunder, but with stillness so total it screams. In the western wing, Prince Zayed stood at the threshold of a decision he had long delayed. The scroll before him was blank, the wax not yet melted, and yet the air around him felt thick with consequence. He had woken earlier than usual, dressed without help, and dismissed the guards at his door with a look that invited no question. He sat at the small cedar-wood desk his mother once used, narrow, intimate, a place for letters of mourning and longing, not decrees. Outside, the courtyard lay empty. Even the birds had grown quiet, as if awaiting the words he had yet to write. He did not begin with her name. He began with silence, not the kind that wounds, the kind that holds. Line by line, he shaped a confession, not of passion, but of recognition. He told her of the spaces where she had lingered after leaving, not as a memory, but as a presence. How the jasmine had bloomed again only days after she vanished. How her absence taught him more than her presence ever could. He did not speak of futures. He offered no promise. He only gave what the palace had never taught him to give, truth unadorned. When the ink dried, he pressed the paper closed and sealed it with a mark no one had seen in years, his mother's personal sigil, a falcon's eye inside a crescent. The wax was black, the gesture deliberate. It was not the seal of a prince. It was the seal of a man who knew the risk of being seen. For the messenger, he chose not a soldier or steward, but a boy who carried laundry and listened to walls, one who had watched the court without ever being watched. "Take this to the woman above the spice vendor with the blue awning," Zayed said, his voice low. "Ask for Dahlia. Leave it. Speak no name." The boy bowed once and disappeared into the light, and the wind rose. It came not from the south, where the sea sent its balm, but from the north, hot, dry, unfamiliar. It stirred the lanterns in the upper corridor. It made the flame of the brass sconces lean westward. It rattled the latticework in the emir's private study. It carried no scent, yet it changed the air entirely. Some noticed immediately. The vizier, seated with diplomats, paused mid-sentence and tilted his head, as if sensing an invisible tremor. The emir, in his silent prayer, blinked as the shutters clicked open without warning. Even the marble, so unyielding, seemed to shift beneath its own weight. And far from that tempest of power and legacy, in a narrow alley where the sun touched only half the stones, Hana opened the shop's wooden shutter with a sigh. She had slept fitfully, dreams chasing her like shadows, her rest punctuated by images she could not name. Water, silk, fire, eyes, always the eyes. She wore linen still damp from washing. Her hands smelled of cloves. The jasmine in the bowl above the lintel had grown brittle. Then came the boy, different again, small, quick, wearing an oversized thobe and fear like perfume. He did not meet her gaze. He simply extended the envelope, nodded once, and disappeared. She held it as though it might bleed. The seal, a black wax crest of a falcon's eye, felt heavier than metal. She did not move for a long time. Dahlia, catching a glimpse of her face, said nothing, only pulled the curtain between rooms and left her alone. Hana sat. She did not open the letter. Not yet. She stared at it, her pulse no longer fast, but deep, as if the blood in her knew more than her thoughts. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. The envelope was not heavy, but it carried weight, because she knew, even unopened, she knew, that something had shifted, that the world, her world, would not be the same again after what lay inside. In the palace garden, Zayed passed beneath the blooming jasmine. The vines had thickened as if answering him. The scent was overwhelming, not sweet but raw, alive. He paused beside the fountain where reflections once danced between them and let the silence settle. He did not wait for reply. He had already heard it, in the wind, in the hush before the council doors, in the unease of a palace that suddenly knew something had been set into motion no one could contain. He looked toward the horizon, where the city shimmered under the heat, and for the first time, he did not wonder if she would forgive him. He only wondered if she would let him see her again. There are letters written with ink, and there are letters written with breath. This was the latter. The moment Hana cracked the wax seal, the air in the room changed. It grew still, not silent, heavy, not oppressive. The walls, lined with dried herbs and hand-woven baskets, seemed to lean in. The clay cup beside her grew cold. Outside, the souk still lived. Merchants haggling, children shrieking, the wind tugging at silks. But none of it touched her. Not now. The paper felt warm in her hands, as if it had absorbed the very pulse of the one who wrote it. Her fingers traced the fold line, hesitant, reverent. She had not known what to expect when the boy handed her the letter. She had not dared to imagine. But even then, before reading a single word, she knew this would not be a command. This would not be a memory. It would be a mirror. She unfolded the letter slowly and saw her name, not preceded by title, not decorated with affection, just the truth of her name, spoken without flourish. And somehow, it struck harder than any confession might have, because he had chosen not to embellish, not to impose. He had chosen to meet her where she was. Her eyes moved across the first lines, and already her breath shortened. He did not begin with apology. He began with observation, with presence, with her. He spoke of the spaces she had inhabited, the alcove near the eastern arch, where she once sat peeling citrus for the princess, the fountain in the jasmine garden where their silences often crossed without collision, the hallway with the high window where she paused every morning to gather herself before stepping into service. He described them not with nostalgia, but with accuracy. He remembered, not the performance of her, but the truth. He wrote of her absence as a new form of presence, how silence had changed after she left, not an emptiness, but a tension, like something waiting to be filled that no longer wanted anything but her. He had tried, he admitted, to settle back into routine, to re-inhabit his role, but something in the architecture of his days no longer fit. The palace had grown too large, the voices too loud, and the garden, oh, the garden, had begun to bloom as if in protest, jasmine out of season, fragrance thick enough to overwhelm even memory. Then came the paragraph that shifted everything inside her. He told her he had no right to ask anything, that he would not, that the letter was not an invitation or a plea. It was a window left open, and if she ever chose to pass through it, it would be of her own will, not as a woman summoned, but as one seen. He would be waiting, not in the halls, not before the court, but where silence lived between them, in the place where names did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. The letter closed with no name, no seal of power, only the faintest inked impression, barely visible unless the light struck it just right. A single jasmine blossom, pressed so delicately into the parchment it seemed like a whisper embedded into skin. Hana did not cry. She read it again, then again, each time slower, as if the words would change, deepen, reveal new meanings between the lines, but they did not. They remained constant, grounded, honest. And then she folded it, not like paper, but like a prayer. She placed it over her heart and sat motionless as the light in the room shifted, gold into amber, amber into dusk. The walls held their breath with her. Her palms were warm, her pulse steady. She was not adrift. She was anchored, for the first time in years, not by duty, not by fear, but by recognition. When Dahlia returned from the back, she saw the look in Hana's eyes and said nothing. She did not ask what the letter had contained. She simply set down a plate of sliced figs and poured fresh tea. And the two women sat in that sacred quiet that exists only after something inside you has been named. Later that night, Hana lit a single oil lamp in her room. The flame flickered, soft and uncertain, casting shadows that danced across the rough plaster walls. She took the letter and placed it beneath the silk shawl she had not worn since the day she left the palace. Then she lay down, not to sleep, but to listen. And what she heard was not the city, or the wind, or even her own heartbeat. What she heard was her own name, finally, truly spoken. And somewhere, across domes and marble, far beyond protocol and palace, Zayed stood in his chamber facing the open window. He did not know if she would answer. He did not know if she would ever come. But in the stillness that followed the setting sun, he felt the weight in his chest lessen, not because he had unburdened himself, but because she had received him, not as a prince, but as a man who dared at last to see her. Some letters are never read aloud, yet their echo travels far. By the second day after Hana had pressed the parchment to her chest, something intangible had begun to shift around her. Not dramatically, not with the force of confrontation, but with the quiet inevitability of rising heat before a storm, felt on the skin long before the clouds gather. It was in the air, in the way a cat paused before leaping, in the way a flame flickered though there was no draft. The souk, once chaotic in its comfort, now felt too quiet, not in volume, but in tone. Conversations dropped as she approached stalls. Laughter died mid-air like a note caught in the throat. The usual rhythm of footsteps over cobblestones continued, but something beneath it had altered. She walked past the olive seller, and though his face remained familiar, his hands hesitated before handing her the pouch of salt-cured fruit. The stall across the street, a place she often browsed without purchase, was suddenly closed, though the lamps inside still flickered. The bread vendor, who always greeted her with a smile and a proverb, now simply nodded. The space around her was changing its texture, not with hostility, but with careful distance. Dahlia said nothing of it, but her gestures shifted. Her hands lingered longer at the lock each night. Her gaze swept the street before opening the shutters in the morning. And once, when folding linen, she paused mid-motion and stared into the middle distance, the way one does when listening not with ears, but with memory. She had lived through this kind of stillness before, the kind that precedes decisions made behind closed doors. There was no question in her eyes, only quiet preparation. In the palace, nothing official had changed, and yet everything had. Zayed's name still held its weight. His word still moved decisions. But behind each bow, each murmured, "Your Highness," there was something else now, a question unspoken, a suspicion unvoiced. The courtiers did not need to ask. They could smell deviation like a hawk smells blood. Power, once shifted slightly, alters the temperature of an entire kingdom. The vizier, ever silent, had begun to act, not with confrontation, but with small corrections. He reassigned the boy from the archives, reordered the schedule of evening audiences, sent an envoy to inspect the southern villas where rebellious sentiments were said to be stirring. None of it pointed directly to Zayed's recent choices, but all of it served one purpose: containment. The prince's steps were still light, his words still measured, but he no longer paced before speaking, no longer adjusted his robe when entering the chamber of advisors. He had grown still, and stillness, when unbroken, becomes unreadable and dangerous. He returned, as always, to the paths behind the colonnades at dusk. He stood beneath the olive tree and watched the sky turn violet above the dome. He placed his hand along the lattice gate, where once Hana had lingered after evening prayers, her breath soft against the stone. He remembered her silence, not as a wound, but as a mirror. He had never truly seen himself until she refused to look at him. And now, the entire palace saw him differently, because he had stopped pretending not to look back. Hana, meanwhile, dreamt not of Zayed, but of gardens, of water trickling through carved fountains, of footsteps trailing behind her but never catching up, of her own hands reaching for something just beyond the curtain. One morning she awoke with a whisper on her lips she did not remember speaking. She sat for hours with the letter unopened once more beside her, as if trying to reabsorb its meaning by proximity alone. When Dahlia entered that afternoon, she carried a box, aged, cedar-scented, bound with silver thread. She said nothing, merely placed it before Hana and stepped back. Hana opened it with care. Inside, nestled in silk worn thin by time, lay a pair of earrings, crescent-shaped, their gold dulled only slightly by age. They carried inscriptions so delicate, they appeared to move when the light shifted. They were not extravagant. They were not meant to impress. They were ceremonial in the way truth is ceremonial. Quiet, weighty, irreversible. She wore them the day she chose herself, Dahlia said, voice low. Hana's fingers brushed the gold. It felt cool, dense with meaning, as if the metal remembered each woman who had dared wear it before. She did not ask whose they were. She did not need to. There was no longer a need for explanation between them. The silence that passed was not empty. It was sacred. Later that night, alone beneath the cracked dome of her sleeping chamber, she lit a single candle and placed the earrings beside the folded letter. For a long time she did not move. The flame bent gently in the breeze that slipped through the lattice window. It danced over the inked script of Zayed's message, the imprint of the jasmine, the subtle gleam of the gold. And as she sat there, still, listening, breathing, the world beyond seemed to hold its breath, because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with swords, but with silence, not with declarations, but with decisions made in a room no one else can see. The wind carried a different sound that morning, subtle but certain. It was not the usual rustle of market awnings or the soft murmur of merchants sweeping their thresholds. It was thinner, sharper, the kind of silence that arrives not from stillness, but from decision. Hana felt it before she saw it, a pressure in the chest, a slight delay in every word exchanged. The space between question and answer had grown wider, heavier, stretched thin by something unsaid. The jasmine in her courtyard had begun to wither at the tips, curling in on themselves like whispers turning into fists. Even the scent had dulled, as though the flower feared its own memory. Dahlia noticed. She always noticed, but she chose her silences carefully. She adjusted the curtains to let less light in, folded linen with sharper creases, began adding a pinch more cardamom to the morning tea. It was her way of preparing the house for what neither of them would say aloud. Something was coming. Not a storm, but a gate, and it was beginning to close. That morning, a man arrived. He wore no insignia, no badge of the court, yet his silence screamed. He stood across the alley, not at her door, not confronting, but occupying space with the certainty of someone who had no need to knock. His eyes did not search. They watched. Not her, but the chair beside her door. Empty, waiting, watched. He left without a word, but he returned the next day, and the next, until even the children stopped playing near her wall, until the neighbors began closing their shutters earlier, until Hana no longer wondered who he was, but who had sent him. In the palace, the decision had already been made, swiftly, quietly. Zayed would leave the capital. It was not a punishment. It was an obligation. An assignment masked in honor, a diplomatic tour of the border provinces, meant to demonstrate the crown prince's dedication to the unity of the realm, to the tribes, to the people. But in truth, it was removal, displacement dressed in duty. The emir had spoken the words with practiced calm. "You are needed where the air is clearer," he had said. Zayed had bowed his head, not out of obedience, but calculation. He saw through it all, the game, the warning, the tactic. They feared not what had happened, but what could. The prince whose gaze lingered too long near the jasmine, the man who had begun to hesitate before fulfilling expectation. They feared the fracture before it formed, so they acted. That night, Zayed did not walk the garden. He remained in his chamber, alone. The light of the moon fell across the carpet like a river of silver, and in his hand, he held the ribbon she had once used to bind her hair. He turned it over and over in his palm. A silent repetition, a prayer made of silk. He did not speak, because sometimes silence was the only way to hold on to something the world was determined to take. Back in the city, Dahlia entered with slower steps. She placed the bread on the table more carefully than usual, the basket lined with a cloth Hana had not seen in months. She sat without invitation, her eyes searching Hana's face, and then, finally, the words came. She did not need to say who. Hana did not respond, not with shock, not with sorrow. She only nodded, slowly, and returned to slicing dates. Her movements were precise, rhythmic, as though stillness could be kept at bay by order. But inside her, something had loosened. A thread pulled free. She had known. She had known the moment the jasmine stopped blooming, the moment the man in the alley appeared, the moment her name was no longer spoken by the vendors with warmth, but with caution. That evening, she stood at the threshold of her home. The sky was layered in fire, crimson bleeding into orange, a horizon fraying with the weight of light. She did not weep. Her eyes were dry, her hands steady, but her breath came slower, as if she had to borrow time from the evening to keep standing. She looked to the west, to the edge of the city, to the direction in which he would soon be sent. She touched the earrings hidden beneath her robe, the ones Dahlia had given her, worn by women who had chosen themselves in times when no one else would. The metal felt cool against her skin, but in her chest, the heat was rising. In the palace, Zayed stood beneath the archway of the inner courtyard, the shadows long behind him, the scent of jasmine still faint in the evening air. He reached for the vine growing along the carved wall, fingers brushing the green as if it might remember her touch. He said her name once, quietly. It did not echo, but it did not vanish. Because some names, once spoken with truth, settle into stone. He turned away, not with resolve, but with restraint. His steps slow, his robe heavy. The air had thickened, not with heat, but with memory. And Hana, back in the quiet of her room, sat cross-legged on the floor. The lamp before her flickered softly. The letter beside her was unopened, still. Yet everything inside her had already been read. The moon, high above them both, cast its light equally on palace and souk, on marble and dust, on silence and longing. It did not choose sides. Something had been interrupted, severed, but not ended. Not yet, not ever. The days that followed moved like water beneath ice, fluid, but numb. In the souk, life resumed its rhythm. Bread was sold, lamps were lit, merchants haggled, and boys chased goats through winding alleys. But something in the way people turned their heads suggested the memory of a wound still tender. Hana no longer lingered among the spice stalls. She moved with purpose now, each step measured, each gaze met with quiet strength. She was not hiding, but neither was she explaining. Her silence had become her armor, not forged in bitterness, but in clarity. The world around her had changed, not loudly, but decisively, as if the city itself had agreed to never ask certain questions again. She took fewer walks, spoke fewer words. But each gesture, placing her tea on the sill at dawn, straightening the fabric along her windowsill, watering the basil with slow, meditative care, became its own form of resistance. She was still here, still whole, and though the man whose name pulsed like a secret behind her ribs was gone, her world had not collapsed. It had rearranged itself around an absence, made space for something unspoken but sacred. Each evening, she returned to the rooftop. From there, she could see the lights of the upper palace tremble faintly against the sky like stars too proud to fall. The dome shimmered when the air cooled, and sometimes, just sometimes, she imagined that he still stood in the courtyard below, hand resting on the lattice, gaze lifted toward the city that once held both their names in a single breath. She never wept, not because there was no grief, but because grief, when truly honored, did not always require tears. Sometimes it simply needed stillness. Zayed had left before the sky blushed. No ceremony, no audience, just a single rider disappearing into the edge of the desert, taking with him a silence heavy as stone. And yet behind him, the walls whispered. The courtiers felt the absence not as relief, but as something unfinished, an ink stroke that ended before the final flourish. The vizier tightened his control. The emir grew quieter, but the tension did not recede. It lingered, like the warmth of a fire long after its embers had faded. In the desert provinces, Zayed shed the weight of silk for rough cotton. He slept beneath stars vast and unjudging, listening to the wind drag its stories across the dunes. He sat with tribal elders and learned their names, their losses, their lineage. He offered protection to a village after a well collapsed, not with royal decree, but by lifting stone with his own hands. At night, he wrapped himself in solitude, lit a single oil lamp, and placed a folded ribbon beside an unopened letter, hers. Every night, the same ritual. Every night, the the same ache. He read no dispatches. He wrote no messages. But the parchment remained there, like a heart beating against memory, refusing to be buried. Back in the city, Hana began to write, not letters, but truths. She filled page after page with the voices she had silenced for years. The child who wanted to dance on rooftops, the girl who once believed that softness was weakness, the woman who had loved a prince and walked away not out of fear, but because she had learned to love herself more fiercely. Her words were not for anyone, and yet, as she wrote, she imagined him reading them, his fingertips grazing the edge of her thoughts. She never signed her name. She didn't need to. If he ever saw them, he would know. The shape of her silences was unmistakable. Spring came early. The jasmine, long dormant, began to bloom with unapologetic wildness. Vines overtook the lattice. The scent flooded her rooms. It did not ask for permission. It returned on its own terms, just as she had. Then one morning, Dahlia handed her a bundle wrapped in linen, small and warm, as if it held something living. Inside, a vessel of hand-thrown clay, sealed in wax. When Hana opened it, she found desert sand, coarse and sun-baked, and nestled at its center, a single pearl, imperfect, heavy, luminous. Her fingers curled around it as if it had always belonged there. No note, no emblem, only meaning. The pearl, something born of irritation, of time, of pressure and sea. The sand, the desert he now walked. He had given her both, the softness and the grit. She did not smile, but her breath caught. Sharp, short, sacred. Days passed. And then, near dusk, a rider came. No escort, no herald, just dust on his shoulders, sweat on his brow, and purpose in his eyes. He rode straight past the palace gates, where guards looked on with surprise but said nothing. He turned down the narrow streets of the old city, toward the place where jasmine bloomed along the walls, and a wooden chair sat like a promise beside the door. He dismounted, hesitated, reached out, but did not knock. The door was open. Inside, the scent of oud lingered. A kettle rested on a stone stove. 2 cups on the table, one filled with dates, the other waiting. A candle burned low, the flame fluttering as though startled by return, and near the edge of the table, a folded page of handwriting, his name at the top, a question mark at the end. Zayed stepped inside. He said nothing. He sat. Some homes do not require knocking. Some stories do not need endings. Only a beginning, written in silence and read by those who waited, not to be rescued, but to be met.